What keeps you awake at night?
Sea levels are rising globally.
Fears fueled by horror stories.
Among the worst flu season in a decade, and it hasn't peaked yet.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous.
Another series of deadly terror attacks.
I don't want to be blamed if you cannot get to sleep tonight.
Ladies, the other day I was at Subway, and I had just gotten home from the gym, and I was like, I'm gonna get myself like a little turkey sub, something to cleanse my palate, right? Something to put something on my stomach. And there's this really cute person working at Subway, and I was like, oh. So I thought I would flirt. And so I was like winking a little, joking a little bit, and I was like, oh, when's your
Wait, I want to make sure I get this image right. You were standing behind the Subway counter and you were winking physically at the person making your sandwich.
Well, no, but I was giving him I was giving him flirty eyes, and I shit you not, I was like talking to them, asking them when their shift was over. We had like this good back and forth dialogue. It was really cute. And then I got like a large soda in my sub, and I was walking out and I was filling my soda up, and then they turned around and they're like, hey, have a good day. And I was like, yep, only 3 more hours of your shift, you can make it. And they're like, haha, yeah. And as I was saying that, I went, bye, and as I threw my hand up, I completely knocked the entire large soda that I had just poured all over the floor and ground.
Brie.
And they just looked at me and they went, you got a large. And I went, yeah.
Are you okay? Do you need help with that? Do you need a napkin? You got a large. Buddy.
Yeah.
Do better.
Yeah, and so then I was like, yeah, and so I just refilled my drink, and then I tried to help with paper towels, and they were like, no, it's fine, we'll get a mop. And I was like, oh, and I just left.
Oh, don't mind us,
no,
we're paid
Brianna.
to clean up after the customers.
Well, I'm sure that's something that keeps you up at night.
Oh
and
my God.
let's use this as an opportunity. Welcome to Things That Keep Me Up at Night.
Hello.
I'm Olivia.
I'm Brooke.
I'm Brie.
And today we are starting a new heavy hitter series, my friends.
Yes.
I've really been hyping my podcast today.
Oh no, we have not heard anything else.
Oh.
For like
Well,
a week.
okay, so let me clarify. So usually the premise is they don't know what I'm going to talk about, and it's a surprise. They know what I'm going to talk about, essentially, and I don't want to spoil it because I'm spoiling it with like my opening. I've very masterfully revealed what my topic is and my narrative, and I would like it to stay that way. But they definitely 100% know that this is what I'm about to talk about.
Yeah, I'm gonna get on my
soapbox
soapbox after you introduce it and tell everybody about your deal.
Well, I'm
right.
just doing what I love, Brooke. Kill me.
Wow.
And isn't that what it's about? Talking about dark shit that no one else is into, that hopefully some viewers at home will be like, yeah, I can relate.
Yeah. We're just having a good time.
Anxiety. My thing.
So, are we ready?
I'm so ready. I'm at the edge of my seat.
So, let me begin by clarifying that there have been hundreds of theories about how this deadly disease evolved, right? I only have an hour, but we all know I could take up like 6, right? I'm really only going to focus on like one big theory on how this evolved. So my tale begins in the early spring of 1918, roughly February, in Haskell County, Kansas. A local doctor, Dr. Loring Minor, to be precise, begins to notice an increase in patients contracting influenza. So, at the time, influenza was generally considered like a seasonal cold, and was so little regarded that doctors rarely reported influenza cases.
Now.
Much less to a government body, right? But there was something strange about this strain. Generally, patients that die from influenza are young children, and the elderly due to their weaker immune systems, right? But people dying from this strain were healthy people, generally in their 20s and 30s, in peak health, right? So This sufficiently concerns Dr. Miner for him to report his findings to the U.S. Public Health Service, a report that's now lost to time. There's like no copy of it because he received no official response. Essentially, they thought, well, it's just a case of the flu, right?
Yikes.
So within the same period, men from Haskell County, the place where this outbreak had been happening, are drafted to fight overseas in World War II. So they're transferred to Camp Funston, which is the local military base for basic training.
Sure.
On March 4th, 1918, the camp cook Albert Gitchell reports to the infirmary with a slight cold. Mm-hmm. Within a few days, 552 men report to the infirmary with similar symptoms. Within 2 weeks, over 1,100 men have been hospitalized.
Oh my God.
It is apparent that this isn't a simple cold, as 20% of the men that are exhibiting the similar symptoms develop secondary pneumonia, and 38 men die. Oh. Okay. So within a month of patient zero, Albert Gitchell, 24 of the U.S.'s 36 largest military bases have their infirmaries full of sick men, while 30 major cities also report similar cases in their hospitals. While doctors are misdiagnosing these symptoms as meningitis or simply treating the pneumonia, this is the beginning of a 15-month pandemic that will decide the fate of the war, instigate revolutions, and wipe out native languages. This, my friends, is the influenza pandemic of 1918. Now, Brooke, if I could just put down this soapbox for you.
Yes, let me just step right up here for a moment. All right. All right, I'm on my soapbox. So, I didn't talk to Olivia for a long time just because of like distance. We went to different high schools, but we had been friends in middle school and then we reconnected in college. And I think it was a couple days after we reconnected, after 5 years of not talking.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Where she asked if I had gotten my flu shot. And my response was, like most people I've ever talked to, no, I haven't gotten a flu shot in a really long time. So began a tirade. You need to go get your flu shot immediately. Do you understand how deadly this disease is? Do you understand that it's like 2 steps away from wiping out the entire planet Earth? The apocalypse will not come at the hands of an exploding sun. It will come at the hands of a flu virus.
Also, like, the fact that legitimately texted me for like a week and was like, gotten your flu shot yet, bitch? And then would send me screenshots of death tolls in different periods of time.
Oh my God, did I really do that?
Yeah, and you were like, you could be a statistic. And she's obsessed with it. So we knew that at some point she was gonna do this just as a topic, so we let her have it. We're just letting her have it.
The thing is that like this sounds like it's insane, and like I would have brushed this off. Olivia was so convincing that the next week I took my boyfriend, dragged him to CVS, and we both got a fucking flu shot.
Yay!
Like, this shit is for real, and I am a believer thanks to this woman.
You know, I think I remember too, like, you told me, you're like, hey, I got my flu shot. I'm like, yay, and I'm so happy for you. And you're like, yeah, you know, I didn't really give it much thought, but then, you know, you sent me all these things, and I'm like, okay, I guess I'll look it up. And you said, I Googled some things, and I went from, and you sent me colon with a capital D to, and then it's D with a colon, a capital D with a colon, which is the happy face to sad face.
Yep.
And I just fucking lost it. So yeah, so this is my time.
Yeah.
If I could have the soapbox, please.
Yeah, well, I'll put my soapbox away. And this episode, guys, this is gonna make you go from colon capital D to capital D colon.
Can that be the title of the episode? Just colon capital D.
That's what I'm doing. 100%.
Wait,
excellent.
Also, I would just like to say that we're doing epidemics for our next heavy hitter big episode series. Yeah. So Olivia's starting off with this.
Yeah, I'm starting off with what I'd like to call a banger. my friends.
Oh my
It
god.
is a banger.
All right.
Oh, man.
Influenza
So we're
sure
ready?
is.
This is we got 11 pages of notes.
Oh my god.
Fucking go. So,
All right.
it is important to note that not everyone was in the dark on the matter, right? One primary actor was William H. Welsh, one of the 4 founders of Johns Hopkins University, my man, and a lead investigator of the outbreak. So at the time, he was collaborating with the Rockefeller Institute, which had been absorbed by the U.S. military, World War I. You've heard of it.
Sure.
And so when he assessed the situation at Funston, he made the following recommendations. Vaccinate the troops for pneumonia, have an ample stock of antitoxin for pneumonia, minimize overcrowding, limit transportation of troops, the huge, right?
This all sounds pretty normal.
His suggestions fell on deaf ears because
But
you
of
see,
course.
guys, they had a war to win.
Oh,
So-
and that's so easy when all your troops are dying of pneumonia.
Well, they're not dying yet, but they're not doing well, right? But his suggestion fell on deaf ears, right? And so in
Sure.
response, they did nothing, and they piled on ocean liners soldiers at twice the capacity of the ocean liners and shipped them all to France, right? And so by the time that troops stepped foot on foreign soil, it was too late, right?
Sure.
The conditions for the trenches gave the virus everything it needed to mutate into the virus that we know today. And it turned into what scientists call the mother of all pandemics.
Ugh.
So,
Chills, Olivia. Chills.
So, before we go into the fun parts, let's talk about science for a little bit. And
Oh,
I'm
I can't wait to
distilling
talk
a
about
lot.
science.
Feel free to ask questions, because I want this part to be super clear. It's actually very important. It's going to sound like I'm on my soapbox for a little too long, but it is super important for the context of the story.
Okay.
Right?
I'm gonna sit crisscross applesauce. I'll raise my hand if I have any questions.
Okay. I can't
Are we-
see that, but I assume
Are we all
that...
on the? We all each have like a little like red square that we're sitting on like a kindergartner like
Yes.
round
Yeah, like
whimsical carpet that has trains on it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
Matt, yeah, for sure.
Are you
Yeah.
ready, boys and girls? Okay, so let's give a background on the influenza virus. God, I can't fucking speak today. All the information I'm about to give you was not available to scientists at the time, but it's super important and it'll give you context of why the virus spreads so rapidly, right?
Okay.
So while all of this is super important, keep in mind that influenza wasn't even isolated until 1933. All throughout the war, scientists believe that influenza was caused by a bacterium, Pfeiffer's bacillum, and they didn't even discover antibiotics until the 30s, right?
God.
So
Yeah, okay.
they're kind of in the dark. They have no idea why this is happening, right? It's just happening, right?
Yeah.
So, influenza is a virus. Additionally, and very importantly, influenza is not the same as the stomach flu. That's a misnomer. Stomach flu or food poisoning is actually caused by norovirus. And while the symptoms are somewhat similar, they are very different viruses. So all viruses are non-living and they require a host to survive. So what that means is when you're infected with a virus, the virus attaches to your cells and then tricks your cells into making copies of the host virus and then releasing those virus particles into the body, right? But there's something very special about influenza. So to greatly distill the discipline of virology, and I apologize to anybody listening who appreciates that, there are 2 major types of viruses. And that's DNA-based viruses and RNA-based viruses. So we all know what DNA is. We've all seen CSI Las Vegas, where we were sick at home in like 5th grade watching daytime TV. But
I also took biology.
I
All
guess.
right. Oh, we got our big boy pants on today.
You went to school in California. You also took biology.
No, I was a pre-nursing major, so I took a lot of biochem classes. But yeah, go on.
Wow.
We got some
Okay.
big boy pants over here.
Anyway, DNA is kind of like the master copy cookbook of our body, right? So if you need to make muscle tissue, our body uses proteins to make copies of the instructions to make muscle tissue, which is stored in our DNA. Those copies are called RNA, right? And then the RNA is translated into muscle tissue, right? That makes sense?
Yep.
So functionally, we have millions of proteins in our body whose sole responsibility is to make sure there are no typos or errors in our DNA, right? But there aren't proteins available to correct errors in RNA. There shouldn't really need to, right? Like if you're constantly correcting the DNA, doesn't make sense to constantly correct all of the copies of RNA. It just functionally doesn't make sense, right? So these RNA-based viruses, they have this great advantage that there are no major proteins responsible for correcting errors. So when influenza inserts the RNA genome into the cell to be copied to make virus copies, the cell has no mechanisms to correct it if there's any mutation that occurs. And so as a result, with each infection, there is a risk that the RNA genome of influenza can mutate and it will go largely unchecked, right? Okay. Which is a huge evolutionary advantage, right? So additionally, the genome of influenza, the RNA, it's not just like one big circle of RNA, it's actually 8 individual molecules of RNA, right? So puts in the 8 individual molecules, copies are made of the 8 molecules, and then each little virus particle has 8 molecules of RNA, right? So this is wildly important for mutation, because essentially what happens, and this is not an uncommon phenomena, called reassortment. So imagine this, you have one single human cell, and it gets infected with 2 different influenza strains, a red strain and a blue strain, and then the 2 strains mix together in the cell. So when you have the virus particle copies, you have some that are all blue, some that are all red, and some that are blue and red, right? That's another form of mutation. And if you're thinking, okay, well, what does that even fucking matter? Like, it's still influenza. Why do I really care? Well, the reason that your body is able to build an immunity against any virus comes down to, is your body able to identify that virus? The more that a virus can mutate, the harder it is for your body to create an immunity and kill it, right? So these mutations are really advantageous as it helps it spread, and it makes it very difficult for bodies to fight it, but it can also change the disease itself. Put a pin in that, because that's going to become very important. But the TLDR, influenza can easily mutate itself when it moves from host to host, so every time it spreads to a new host, it has a higher likelihood of mutating.
It's like the Thing.
It is like the Thing. Scary shit, right? So that's a lot of complicated shit. Really hope that distilled well, right? But that's important. So now we're going back to war, right?
Sure.
Never good. So troops landed in early April of 1918. Okay? On April 10th, the first case of influenza was identified in French troops. That's like less than 2 weeks, right?
Wow.
So the first symptoms of this were greatly minimized. It was called the 3-day fever, the knock-me-down fever. Generally, the symptoms were fever, sweating, headaches, or coughing, right? But that could also be caused by like a myriad of diseases that were happening at the time. So it was really hard to distill it down and be like, oh, this is definitely influenza, right? The big issue was that even though these major symptoms would only last for like a few days, it would take weeks for you to fully recover from this outbreak. It was a tough disease to go through, right? And so by May, the British had developed symptoms of influenza. And so this is when bells were finally rung an alarm, because the illness was affecting the troops' ability to fight, which is clearly all we care about during World War I. So consider the conditions, though, right? You have thousands of men confined into very tight spaces, sleeping within inches of each other. All of them have compromised immune systems because they're physically exhausted and emotionally strained, and the men are being rotated between camps almost daily, so there's essentially no shortage of victims to infect, right? There's no limit on how fast this disease can burn, right? So it's no wonder that by May, there were so many people filling military hospitals that even though beds were like inches apart in the hospital, they had to lay patients outside just for the sake of space, right? They just did not have room for all of these people. So obviously, because this was becoming an issue as far as winning the war goes, people finally started caring, right? So the issue is the time period, right? So in the U.S., Woodrow Wilson had founded the Committee of Public Information, whose intentions can best be summarized by an advisor of the committee that wrote, "Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. The force of an idea lies in its inspirational value. It matters very little if it is true or false."
Oh.
Dope.
Boy.
The Sedition Act was also passed, which made publishing anything negative about the U.S. government or the war a punishable offense that would earn you 20 years in prison. Right?
Yep.
And then war propaganda was urging them to report anybody who, quote, spreads pessimistic stories, cries for peace, or belittles our effort to win the war. Right? So...
God, the U.S. is fucking scary.
Well, that's not even just the U.S. Like, the British had similar sanctions, so did
right.
France
Yeah.
and Germany, right? Like, all of the wartime countries were very, very concerned on this getting leaked because it would belittle the war effort, right?
Right.
I just like how it's like, let's punish those promoting peace. Like,
Fuck those
20
hoes.
years.
Right? Seriously, right? So, like, the first time that there was even admitted that there was a problem was when the King of Spain fell ill, and Spain wasn't really part of World War I, right? So they really had no stakes in declaring if there was an issue, right? But of course the wartime countries fucking leapt on this opportunity and said that there was a Spanish flu outbreak, which is how it got its name. So in fact, it didn't originate in Spain at all. There are some theories that actually originated in China, some in France, others in the US. Regardless, they noticed that it had symptoms like in the US as early as like February. But I believe at this point it's like May. Right?
Right. I had no idea it didn't originate in Spain.
Nope. Yeah, it's literally just because Spain was like, hey, we have a problem.
There's this flu thing.
And they're like, what?
It's yours. You own it now.
You guys did it.
You get a flu. You get a flu. Everybody gets a flu.
Yeah, it's a little... fucking ridiculous. And studies found later, like as early as 1927, that most places in the world actually did have this first wave of the flu, but it wasn't reported because it was considered very mild. Nobody was dying yet. It was very debilitating. Right. Now, yes, this was the most mild strain during the 15-month period, but there were some pretty concerning symptoms, right? Okay. Big ones. So as early as February of 1918, it was observed that those who died from this illness were the young and the healthy. As early as March, doctors were misdiagnosing this as meningitis, which causes inflammation in the tissues surrounding the spinal cord and brain. Upon performing autopsies in the dead, there was often so much hemorrhaging in lung tissue that doctors postulated this might be a new disease, right? And all of these were very clear indicators that something was seriously different about this wave, right? But no one did anything until it got too late. So there are many theories to explain why the flu had mutated so rapidly and savagely. Like I mentioned in the one in the beginning, like inherently how the flu operates, the more hosts that it has, the more it is going to mutate, right? And this is just a plethora of hosts to blow
Everybody's
through.
just in one place.
Right? So the more hosts available, more opportunity for RNA mutation and for reassortment. But others have suggested that this is actually influenza's natural evolution from an avian-based strain to a human-based strain, because influenza is an avian-based illness. It usually originates in birds. It's just that this evolution was widely unchecked, right? Wow. Others have ideas that troops were exposed to mustard gas, which is a known mutagen, and this could have induced some kind of genetic mutations. If you were carrying the virus, it would induce mutation, right?
Yeah, wow.
Do you think people were aware at the time that this could have happened, or was there no science at this point that showed that mustard gas could mutate?
Oh no, they had no idea. Okay. I'm sure they didn't know until much later.
That'd be a clever way of warfare.
They didn't even know that this was a virus, right? They just kind of thought that this was a bacteria. They didn't even know about genetic material at this point, right?
Jesus Christ, yeah.
So whatever the reason, our story's going to bring us back to the U.S., right? While the flu has gone on to infect and cripple the German army during a crucial offensive, right? So still ravaging in Europe, but it's going to get a lot worse in the U.S. So speaking of crippling disease, I want to talk about something unrelated to that, right?
Great segue,
Great
Olivia.
transition.
Speaking of this thing, let's talk about something not related.
Just to take a break.
Do it.
We're partnering with Wine and Crime for a shout out. It's a cute little true crime podcast where they drink wine, right, and talk about crime. If you're interested in that, listen to them now.
Hey true crime fans, have you listened to Wine and Crime yet?
We're a true crime comedy podcast hosted by 3 childhood friends who chug wine, chat true crime, and unleash our worst Minnesotan accents.
Each week, us gals pick a true crime topic and pair it with a delicious wine before delving into the background and psychology behind the crime.
Then we share and speculate wildly about a couple of bonkers cases related to the topic.
Past episodes include necrophilia, cults, crimes of passion, cruise ship disappearances, exorcisms gone wrong, all this over a bottle of wine, or, let's be real, 3.
Listen anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Wine and Crime Pod, and check out our website and blog at wineandcrimepodcast.com.
Cheers!
So
that was Wine and Crime, and we love them. Thank you so much for the promo for promo.
yeah,
We
love them so
seriously,
much.
They're so funny. I fucking adore them.
They're so cute.
So, back to death.
Okay,
Right,
well,
right.
it was a
Well,
nice
not
break,
yet.
Brooke.
So it's July of 1918. And Welsh is called to the army training camp just outside of Boston called Camp Devens. So, upon his arrival, he finds that the military hospital is brimming with sick men that have been crammed into makeshift hospital tents like sardines. The men are exhibiting the usual symptoms: headache, fever, coughing, fatigue. But there's something different this time. Men are screaming in a state of fevered delirium. The coughing is so intense that men are ripping their abdominal muscles and they're hemorrhaging from their noses. In some cases, the coughing causes small tears in the lung tissue from which air leaks out and settles underneath the skin. So when nurses make their rounds to rotate patients, the air causes them to pop like Rice Krispie cereal.
God, no.
Yeah.
Physical pain in my body.
But
My whole body feels the pain.
worse
No.
is that the disease is spread to medical staff,
They didn't do anything
half
wrong.
of which are ill. Some even collapsed and died without exhibiting any symptoms.
What?
Any who didn't die from immediate collapse developed secondary pneumonia and died. Welsh begins dissecting a patient that exhibited cyanosis before they died, which is like a bluish discoloration of the skin as a result of not getting oxygen, right? And finds that the patient's lungs had become so filled with fluid that the patient must have drowned to death.
Okay.
Okay, so Roy
What the
Grist,
fuck?
a physician... Yeah, Roy
This
Grist.
is my nightmare.
You don't even fucking know, bitch. You don't know. A physician stationed at the hospital at Devens wrote a colleague about the outbreak. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have mahogany spots over their cheeks, and a few hours later, you can see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over their face. It is only a matter of a few hours until death comes. It is horrible. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day. For several days, there were no coffins, and the bodies were piled up something fierce. So, the cyanosis, the lack of oxygen, was actually so bad that in certain Caucasian men, it would be so severe that upon their death, you wouldn't be able to tell whether they were white or black.
Holy shit.
Yeah. The scene paints a really perfect picture of the newest development in the pandemic, the second wave of influenza. So this is the wave that after it's been through Europe, it is mutated, and this is the second wave that's going to fucking obliterate the human race, right? Camp Devens is the ground zero for wave 2. in the U.S. And at its peak, 1,543 soldiers were admitted to the hospital in a single day.
Jesus.
Right? Welsh immediately calls the Army Surgeon General Gorgas and demands that he expand hospital space and cease troop movement. Right?
No
so
shit.
initially, the
God.
U.S. Army denies Gorgas's petition to put a halt on drafting and potentially quarantining troops before they're transferred. Their argument is they have a war to win. They send out
I'm
the
gonna
next
repeat it.
draft.
That's really easy when all your troops are dead.
Yeah.
Wow.
They literally sent out the next draft, which would gather thousands of men in cramped government buildings to fill out their paperwork. And Gorgas rebutted that, as it is, all military training in military camps had stopped due to the virulent illness. So the government would be essentially signing men up to be transferred to camps to get sick, right? And so essentially after more camps were infected with this illness, they canceled the draft. They just... So many people were infected with the illness, right? This lukewarm response is far from irregular, and a similar tale is told a few states over in Illinois. So on September 21st, the first wave arrived in Camp Grant, and with 70 hospital admissions in a single day, that's a lot of people, right?
Yeah, wow.
Quickly, admissions skyrocketed beyond what the medical staff was capable of providing, leading to a doctor to plead with Colonel Charles Hagedorn, the commanding officer, right? He implored him to expand the hospital as overcrowding far exceeded what regulations would allow. Hagedorn refuses and says that overcrowding is necessary for war, right?
Well.
2 weeks later, on October 7th, the doctor returned with little to say other than that a quarter of the men were sick, 500 men have died, the last transport train they had just sent out had become a plague train, and the camp had run out of coffins. Hagedorn asked the man to leave his office and then proceeded to take his own life.
Yeah,
because he felt personally responsible for the death of the 500 men, right? So, while the outbreak from Camp Grant is like no way unique, and in some cases their numbers are actually better than other camps, in their camp of about 40,000 men, 10,000 contracted the disease and 1,060 died in total.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know how I would have been able to live with myself either. Like, damn, that is a lot of people.
And I don't want to like, when I told my parents this, my dad was like, "Good fucking riddance." But like, I really want to emphasize, like, it's not like this guy. I mean, imagine up to this point, everyone had really considered this like a seasonal illness.
Yeah,
like everybody
this was
gets
unprecedented.
the flu, right? This was in a matter of like a few months. Like it just radically evolved to kill. I think he was just functioning off of like, well, I've had the flu before and it's not that bad and it's never killed this many people. I don't think anyone would have been able to estimate that 500 people could die in 2 weeks.
No.
Absolutely. Well, and you think they're not medically advanced enough to know what's truly going on. You know, so they don't even know like the close quarters are a thing that's going to impact people. You know, like it's just it's 2020 hindsight is 2020, right? Yeah. So it's
hard.
It's
hard to speak negatively about people that literally didn't even know that this was caused by a virus, right? So
yeah, they just didn't know. Man, that's tough. That is tough.
So the second wave finally makes its appearance in civilian populations. A Navy vessel from Boston, which is the area where Camp Devens was, goes from Boston to Philadelphia. And when the naval ship takes port, the disease explodes in the Navy population. Wilmer Cruson, the city's public health advisor, claims that there's no concern and that the flu will be confined to the Navy shipyard, right?
Famous last fucking words.
Seriously. The day after he makes that announcement, 2 people die. So in response, the press continues to report that this isn't the Spanish flu, but some other disease, and that it's completely under control.
Yeah, it looks like it.
So then they held a parade. So,
oh my god, this is like a fucking dystopian novel.
Can I ask a question? Was the parade just them gathered around in a tight circle, sweating on each other, and then seeing who can cough the hardest?
No, so essentially Liberty loans were loans you could take out to help
Bree,
fund
it's one
the
of your
war.
good old coughing
Liberty
contests.
loans. So
Famous
essentially,
American pastime. Go on.
Yeah, well,
fucking Christ.
Well, because like I think it's important to realize that there was like little. What if there was just like little carts among the parade where it's like, we'll cough on you for 50 cents.
50 cents is a lot of fucking money, Brie.
Oh,
I'm calling it 15. 15 is high enough.
A nice shiny nickel.
Essentially, Liberty loans were loans you could take out to like help fund the war, and they weren't selling very well for obvious reasons. So they threw a parade, which would consist of hundreds of people marching across the city and thousands of people attending it. What the fuck?
Yeah, packed shoulder to shoulder.
God fucking Christ. So doctors and scientists could not even begin to explain why this would be a horrible idea, especially with influenza already being introduced to the city. Like, in spite of the demands and petitions of the experts, the mayor decides to ignore their warnings and throw the parade anyways. And with the parade going forward, the papers refused to publish warnings from doctors about public gatherings, and the clock started ticking towards a breakdown.
God.
So
well, because you gotta also think about like they would have been punished for posting shit about anti-propaganda stuff.
Right.
So like, what other choice did they have?
Right. They couldn't fucking do anything, and they didn't want to discourage people from buying Liberty loans. So September 28th, 1918, the Liberty Loan Parade was held. And 2 days after the parade, there was not any spike in influenza. The city's health advisor, in his arrogance, announced the success of the parade and celebrated the lack of illness about. But what he didn't know was that the incubation period for influenza is 2 days. So it would take about 2 to 3 days for symptoms to even show. And it did, because within 3 days after the parade, the hospital began to fill and the medical staff began to die. And quickly the city descended into chaos. So the hospitals were not only filling up, but they were so cramped for space that beds were stacked from wall to wall, but also local morticians posted their staff to stay at the hospital and pick up bodies as soon as they died to pick up bed space. Like they were so short on bed space, people would just be waiting for you to die.
Jesus Christ.
To save time, nurses began putting tags on patients that had started to turn blue for easy identification. So essentially you see a tag at the end of somebody's bed and you're like, cool, I'll just wait it out over here.
And they were still alive.
Oh my god.
Right? Quickly.
Can you imagine being the nurse though that had to do that? Just, hey, Mr. Johnson, how you feeling today? And then he's just like coughing. You're like, all right, I'm just gonna put this tag on the end of your bed, but here's a Jell-O cup.
Oh man, dude,
Christ.
seriously.
Can you imagine being the patient though? Like,
see the fucking
just laying
tag
in your bed, and then they fucking tag your toe.
If
you're not going to be
one's
cognizant
done.
for that. You were like, I guarantee you, like, people couldn't even move. You wouldn't even be aware.
If I was the nurse, I would try to like distract them with an ice cup, and then like slowly with the other hand just like put the tag there. You know,
like one of your pen lights, and you're like, "Oh, look at the pretty light."
Ooh.
And then you just put the little tag on.
They're like, what's that? And you're like, oh, what? The light?
Fun little game that we're all playing. It's just a fun little game.
Gotta keep everybody's spirits up, right?
So the morgue begins to fill too.
Jesus.
Essentially the clergy arrive to assist in the transporting of bodies and are absolutely shocked at what they find. The morgue is at 12 times its maximum capacity.
Jesus.
And the cemeteries are not faring any better. They've run out of space to bury people. So families who have the strength to do so will wrap their family's bodies in bed sheets, carry them on wheelbarrows to the cemetery, drop them off and leave because they have nowhere to put them.
That is trauma.
That's fortunate though, because if you are not strong enough to carry a body to the cemetery, most people were so ill they would just leave the dead bodies in their home and eat and sleep and live next to a dead body until somebody could pick it up. because they didn't have the strength to move the dead body out of the house. So the clergy began taking the bodies from the morgue, and they began digging mass graves 2 coffins deep, making note of where people were buried. But even their efforts were in vain, because the bodies would fill the morgue just as quickly as they were buried, and soon the city is forced to rent a warehouse for morgue overflow, just for the sake of having places to put bodies. The city has run out of coffins, and they've also run out of wood to build coffins. Pennsylvania, the state with just trees, has run out of wood to build coffins, right? Google a picture of Pennsylvania, and I want you to realize why that's insane to me.
For all our listeners in Pennsylvania, they're just on the edge of their seats right now. They cannot handle it.
Ran out of fucking trees?
Yeah, seriously, right? In the first week alone, 1,000 people died. By the second week, 5,000 people died.
That's not a good trend.
Things were so bad that citizens had to step up to replace government infrastructure because so few people were available. So citizens volunteered their own carriages to move bodies. Women volunteered to operate switchboards, and people ran ambulances, right? However, in spite of all the generosity, people were still living in fear. Thousands of orphan children sat up in the government offices unclaimed because families were too afraid of letting people in their homes. For the stats, for anybody interested,
I am.
The city of Pennsylvania had a population of somewhere between 1.5 to 1.8 million, general census estimate, right? And over 500,000 people were infected and 12,000 people died, right? Cities did their best to combat spread by canceling public events, shutting down schools and churches, and even staggering business hours, but there's nothing they could do to undo that parade.
Yeah, that did.
And just to compare, to like show how successful like actually managing this was, New York City, on the other hand, was a symbol of success. They began quarantining people the second they heard that there was an outbreak on the Western Front. Local officials and professionals collaborated to ban spitting and sneezing without covering your mouth. They'd cancel events, they'd stagger work hours, they urged the sick to stay home and contact doctors. The first onset of symptoms, they set up medical centers and sent nurses on house calls. They demanded everybody wore face masks, right? As a comparison, New York City had somewhere between like 4.7 to 5.6 million inhabitants, rough census estimate, right?
Sure.
They had less than 150,000 cases of influenza and only 20,000 people died, right? Compared to Philadelphia, that's pretty fucking great. And statistically, they had the lowest death rate on the Eastern Seaboard because of that.
God, it's so terrifying that like they put all that into place and that many people still died.
Yeah, I mean, but you got to think about how populated New York is. You know,
I know,
that's
and that's like a good stat for this outbreak, but my God.
Yeah, I mean, it shows how fucking powerful it is, right? Jesus.
Yeah, that's
insane.
Nightmare. This is nightmare fuel, Olivia.
Yeah, you don't even know, man. We haven't even gotten to native developing countries.
Stop saying that.
Can I pause for a second and say I've never heard Olivia laugh like that in my entire life.
We've known her for a while.
Wow. Panicked laughter. So again, the public was very aware that something was going on. Like, they're not stupid, right? So they read that the obituaries were pages long. They saw people collapsing in the street. They saw that they were running out of coffins. They saw that neighboring towns had run out of coffins. But they're being told in the papers that everything is okay, right? In San Antonio, 53% of the town was sick. And people were dying within hours of developing the first symptoms, right? People know something's happening. So, of course, rumors started growing because the media wasn't being transparent. So, you know, there are normal rumors of, like, biological warfare from the Germans, or the dogs carried the disease, leading to people euthanizing thousands of dogs. They rumored that it was batches of poisoned aspirin. Of course, many claim that this was God's judgment, and as many do during times of tragedy, they organized some group prayers. Bad idea, because the plague spread through group prayers. But,
very effective.
People didn't know what to do. Nobody knew
I know.
what this was. And church sermons were being canceled. There was no way to hold a proper funeral. And the way the bodies were disposed of was pretty horrific. I watched an interview done by the Alabama Department of Archives and History with a woman named Edna Register Boone. She was about 10 during the time of the outbreak in Alabama. And she said that when one family died, she and her parents had wrapped them up in their own bed sheets and buried them in a common grave because that's all they could do for them. They got buried in the clothes they died in. She said during the epidemic, she couldn't recall a single church funeral that occurred. And in a religious city, that's a really, really big deal.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Her town operated under the care of a single doctor, as do most small towns, who did his best, but I mean, he didn't have a ton of medicines available to him.
Yeah.
And, you know, she said if you tried to take somebody to the hospital, God forbid you tried, it would be miles away, and they'd probably die by the time that you got there. And if they didn't, by some miracle, there would be no room for them.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And considering how rural most of America was, I assume that her stories like hers are not uncommon. Right?
Yeah, of course.
You know, and there was really no way to treat this. They hadn't discovered viruses yet. The closest they'd gotten is a combination vaccine where it contained antibodies from all the bacteria they found in dying patients. Sad enough, this was developed by the Rockefeller Institute, which had been subsumed by the military, so they only provided it to military personnel. It didn't work, but if it did, that would have been a pretty disheartening. So it didn't work, and doctors, in a way, they said we weren't really quite sure what we were fighting, so it was like fighting an invisible ghost, right? During this time period, they still believed in miasma, which is like bad air. So they encouraged people to hold, like, court hearings, educational lectures, church services, and even haircuts outside to prevent the collection of quote-unquote bad air. And, you know, I don't want to really discredit doctors. They were doing their best given what they had available to them.
They were at the mercy of their own advancements.
Right, and, you know, they found ways to drain the lungs of pus to prevent cyanosis. They had revolutionized ways to treat symptoms of the flu, which greatly reduced mortality. Nurses kept patients hydrated, which was super important. The incident allowed Red Cross to study and understand the infection cycle. But even then, all in all, about 28% of the U.S. was infected, right? And it's estimated that about 670,000 people died.
God. And that's just in the U.S.
That's just the U.S., right? And while things were improving in the Western world, those in the developing world were not doing great. So, like I have said previously...
How did it get there? Sorry, go on.
So I'll tell you. People were stocking ships far over maximum capacity. The result of this is people, like, the few that were sick, everybody would fucking get sick, right? They overstocked every aspect of the place. Everybody's sleeping in big barracks. Like, it was just a recipe for disaster. And so as they did, influenza arrived to places like Africa, India, and the Pacific Island because they could only get supplies through ships. And so plague ships would deliver the plague every place that they dropped off at.
God.
And it moved so fast. So, for example, Kimberley, a city in South Africa, tracked the movement of influenza and found that it had moved 1,000 miles inland in a single week.
Jesus Christ.
Because, I mean, this was an area where they had significantly less medical supplies, right? And so, in that first autumn wave in South Africa, 2,500 people died, which is about a fourth of their workers at the time.
Right.
And then, you know, the disease built upon racial prejudice. So years later, during apartheid, when they passed laws about black citizens entering the city without a pass, that was actually based on this theory at the time that black people were carrying influenza.
Oh my God.
Right. Which is disturbing. And all in all, about 500,000 people in South Africa died.
I think that might be one of the more disturbing things you've said, that in the face of national tragedy and an outbreak of that magnitude, that it was used as a political bargaining chip against a certain race. That's crazy.
Yeah, this isn't isolated. I have more examples. You know, for one, India, right?
Sure.
So in this case in particular, India was kind of set up to fail as far as supplying Western medicine. India had been under British rule for decades, under the crown, right? And millions upon millions of Indians had died previously from disease, whether it's smallpox, cholera, bubonic plague. They'd had several pandemics in India alone, right?
Yeah.
Or epidemics, I should more appropriately say. Pandemics is globally, epidemics is like in a big country, right? So a government initiative to help citizens was really lacking at best, right? In the previous outbreak, there was a bubonic plague outbreak in 1896, and the British government had responded to the outbreak by quarantining people in quote-unquote health camps, travel restrictions.
Bad feelings. I'm getting those bad tinglies, Olivia.
You know, when I hear those words, health camp, it doesn't go, oh cool.
That's right.
So it's like a YMCA.
No, it was definitely very...
Camps where you die.
Oh,
Christ.
man. Jesus
This is
Christ.
so bad.
Yeah, they burned people's belongings. They instituted intrusive bans of traditional Indian medicines. They sprayed people's homes with, I think it's carbonic acid or something.
Oh my God.
So no matter how helpful or harmful the measures were towards the plague, whatever the science was, the measures were really dehumanizing and lacking in compassion. And so now there's a new pandemic, and Indians are less than willing to accept assistance from their white oppressors. I think
Absolutely.
that's fair.
Fair.
But I
No
mean,
thanks, we'd rather die.
but I mean, like, the British weren't really all inclined to help them either, so it was kind of like, we're not accepting anything from you, and the British were like, we were planning on offering it, and then they just, like, clap their hands and walk away like it was a good deal. So similar to the American counterparts, they were left to just carry out and dump bodies. But unfortunately for them, they didn't really have anywhere to put them. It is a very wet country, and generally in India they would burn people on pyres so that it would minimize waste, but they'd run out of things to burn. So they just dumped them in the waterways.
Yeah,
and bodies were just clogging the waterways. And this was a really great foothold for revolutionaries at the time because, you know, the government was obviously not going to help them. So there were revolutionaries traveling all across India delivering folk medicines that, you know, at best were treating symptoms, but it made citizens far more sympathetic to their cause, considering that they were helping them. So actually, good news, decades later, the support of these revolutionaries that they gained from helping others during the pandemic would actually be instrumental in their gaining independence from the crown. But at the time, we can only look at the immediate, and India alone, 14 to 20 million people died.
God damn.
That's about 5% of the population.
That is staggering.
That's not the worst. Right, so these were areas that had both South Africa and India had experienced outbreaks before. They had moderately strong immune systems, right? You know, so that's very similar to Asia. But the places that were hit the far worst were very isolated communities who had not really experienced a lot of disease before, because inherently their immune systems are going to be a lot weaker. So the one I wanted to really focus on was the Alaskan Native population. And, you know, which is shocking to me that these Alaskan populations that really had no, you know, investment in trade or you know, communication with the outside world, there were areas of Alaska where they still believed that the Tsar was in charge and owned Alaska because they were so remote.
Oh my God.
Wow.
They still got I call it the plague. It's been called the plague so many times in a lot of these things. They got influenza. In fact, Alfred Crosby, the author of The Forgotten Pandemic, claimed the Spanish flu did to Nome and the Seward Peninsula with the Black Death did to 14th century Europe.
Jesus Christ.
So you remember I said about 5% of India died. About 8% of the Alaskan Native population perished due to the flu. In fact, a little quote, Ebenezer Evans, a 37-year-old teacher in Nome, he was in charge of containing the epidemic after his predecessor died from the flu, funny enough. And he wrote in a report, "As one walked the streets of Nome, it seemed the city of the dead. A panic had struck the natives, and their feverish conditions suggested the need of colder air. They would leave their beds of sickness and go into the cold air, inducing pneumonia, carried them away rapidly. From 10 to 20 natives were dying each day on average in Nome, and the dead wagon was in use constantly. Many were frozen to death during the night, their fires having gone out." The same man sent out dog teams to ensure that other communities were doing well, but the team had found huddled bodies along the road as flu days victims had wandered from their homes in negative 50-degree weather searching for their families. Because they, when you're in that fevered state, it caused delirium, which was another really big issue for these communities. They would wander out trying to find their families and die. They found dogs fighting over the dead bodies of their families because they would even sometimes forget to just tend their fire because they were so weak, and they would die in the night. In Haines area, 95% of the 150 residents died from the flu.
Jesus Christ.
And that's just like the US. There were no funerals, just mass graves, right?
You couldn't.
And, things were just as bad in warmer climates, right? In Tonga, 10% of the population died. In Fiji, 14% in 16 days. In Vanuatu, 90% of the population in certain villages died, resulting in the extinction of 20 unique languages. Compare that to the 2% death rate of the entire world. That is very high, right?
It was everywhere then, huh?
Even 5% is high, but
5% is crazy.
That the difference between 2 and 5% is several million lives, right? So let's compare the preparedness of two countries just to show the devastation, right? So Governor John Poyer of the American Samoa, he was an active listener of the radio, so he heard that what is also called the Blue Plague had begun making its way across the Pacific Islands. So immediately he was put on high alert, and he closed the port the second he heard that, which is so smart.
Yeah, wow.
He stationed patrols to make sure that no one snuck in, and he escorted any crew member that was ill, anybody that arrived that was ill, or anybody that was there that was ill, to Navy quarantine vessels far away from the rest of Samoa, right? He extended the aid to Western Samoa, which is the non-American territory, and the governor was so offended that he offered aid and undermined him that he hung up. So when you count the score, there's a very clear winner. Western Samoa witnessed a 22% death rate in their population in the matter of 2 months.
Oh, are you fucking serious?
A third of which were working males. The elder population was virtually wiped out. The fields were barren because nobody could work them, so there was a famine that resulted the following year.
God.
The American Samoa, on the other hand, was 100% influenza-free until its quarantine was lifted in 1920. So, they did great. And months before, Victor Vaughn, the Army's Communicable Disease Division, hardly one to exaggerate, wrote that if the epidemic continues its mathematical rate of acceleration, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of a few weeks. But it stopped. By the summer of 1919, it was all over. First, second, and third waves had all come to a close. How? Well, nobody's quite sure.
That's scary. That scares me so much.
Yeah,
I'm so scared.
Nobody really knows. The general theory is that everybody that had contacted the first wave was moderately more immune to the second and the third waves, which is why they predict that so many native cultures were decimated because they didn't receive the first wave. They received the second, which was the more lethal one, and the third, which was equally as lethal, but more mild because I think more people had developed an immunity. Some theorize that maybe it just ran out of fuel since herd immunity started taking place and other people had already been infected and died.
Wow.
Whatever the reason, we don't really know. Come summer, the flu was a distant memory, and we don't know why it stopped. So, just for the sake of it, let's just run the numbers.
I'd rather not. Thank you.
So it's incredibly challenging to calculate the number of people that died during the outbreak.
Sure.
Just because record keeping was so imprecise. It would be hard to do that now, let alone in 1918. But here's the current math, right? So in a matter of 15 months, 500 million people were infected. So that's about a third of the world's population at the time. Breaking it down by country, here's how many people died. In India, I think it was anywhere from, 14 to 20 million, right? Indonesia was about 4 million. Russia was about 1 million.
These are deaths, not infections?
These are deaths.
Okay.
In Iran, it was anywhere from 900,000 to 2.4 million. France, about 400,000. Japan, 390,000. The UK was 220,000. And then the US was 675,000. The global mortality rate was about 2%. Of the 500 million, 10 to 20% of the infected died. So comparably, the usual epidemic mortality rate for influenza is about 0.1%.
Yeah, wow.
So that's a lot more. And if that's not really enough to understand the severity, which I don't know how it's not, the pandemic was so severe that from 1917 to 1918, the life expectancy in the US fell by 12 years.
Good lord.
So it fell to 36.6 years for men and 42.4 years for women. Again, this is volume, right? And I know that many people dying in 15 months is a lot, but the rate wasn't consistent, right? So in the first 25 weeks, the pandemic killed as many as 25 million people. So it's about 1 million people a week. More people died in the first 24 weeks of influenza than 24 years from HIV. And more people died in that single year than from 4 years during the bubonic plague in 1347 to 1351. The pandemic had a global impact. So the way Native people were treated in colonized countries only fed revolutions, right? It was the phenomena of how come you get the medicine and I don't, right?
Yeah.
So the fatigue from the flu probably contributed to the depression that occurred after the World War. That was a major factor, right? And the pandemic has been called many things, right? The Spanish flu, La Grippe, the Blue Plague, God's punishment for living in a country of sin, many things.
God damn.
But there's really one phrase that I think really rings true for me whenever I read it, and it was the forgotten plague. So I really hope that I did my best at articulating the severity of this pandemic, because it was very hard to find information on this. Essentially, we were a country so focused on war, with laws in place where we couldn't talk about anything negative. And as a result, there are very, very few published accounts of what happened. There was a single book at the time called Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and I searched for days for primary resources, narratives, documents from doctors, poems, anything, and there's just not a lot out there. There's not a lot of firsthand accounts from survivors, from medical professionals, nothing. We were a world experiencing a plague that we weren't supposed to talk about. And there's a lot of theories, essentially, all the laws, consider all the laws, we weren't supposed to talk about it. This was also a generation of people who were not, the concept of getting a disease and dying was not a new concept to them, right?
Think of the business as usual, I guess.
It's definitely worse than usual, but, it's people died. It was coming off like cholera and tuberculosis outbreaks.
Right.
Not to mention the emotional trauma that comes from, imagine you come home from war and you find out your entire family is dead, right? Not just, some family members like mom, dad, sister, brotor, aunts, uncles, grandma, papa,
Everybody
all
was
of that.
gone.
It was a very traumatic 15 months, and it's just so saddening in a way that this horrific 15 months happen, and all we really have to show for it is like a lot of really fucked up statistics and maybe some photos of people with masks. Not even any of the pictures really depicted as it truly was, right? It's very much business as usual, but in a mask. And yes, people are going to say that it's a lot better now and we're more equipped to deal with something like this. And the answer is yes and no. Yes, we have a better understanding of medicine. We have more resources available for us to deal with an outbreak. But consider this, right? Our flu shot is a combination shot, much inspired by the combination vaccines produced in 1918. However, essentially what happens now is scientists study all of the strains that are most prevalent in a given year, and then use math and computer modeling to best predict the sequences that we'll see in the coming year, combine 3 different sequences in one shot, and that's the flu shot, right? The only thing is the shot is only as effective as the number of people who take it. So let's say 41% of adults in the US get vaccinated, which, by the way, is the number, apparently. 41% of adults in the US get the flu shot.
That's higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah.
So that's the numbers for last flu season. So let's say we're working with about 59% of America. That's acting as a big breeding ground for influenza RNA to mutate or for its viral genome to reassort. So the more hosts available for influenza, the more opportunities it has to infect and mutate, and the more dangerous it can become, right?
Right, because it mutates outside of what the vaccine accounts for.
Right, and so the less people get vaccinated, the more it's going to mutate, and then the less effective the vaccine is going to be inherently, just by definition of how the virus works. Which is why we have to get it every year, because the year previously, the strains that are available are not something you'd seen the year before, which is why you're supposed to get it every year. It's the only vaccine we have to do that for, but there's also, you have to get boosters, right, for other vaccines, and the reason why you have to do that is because it mutates and you need to be covered for the following years. I think tetanus is every 10 years or something.
Like that, yeah.
The flu is the only one we're supposed to get it every year because of how quickly it mutates. Like, consider that, right? And so let's say, worst case scenario, it does mutate to something bad, something comparable to 1918. Current day, with our technology, it would take, I think at the very least, working full speed, 3 to 4 months to fully analyze, sequence, and come up and test a vaccine for this new deadly strain, right? And at that point, months later, would it even be effective? I mean, I'm not quite sure. Would it have continued to mutate in those 3 to 4 months to the point where the vaccine wouldn't help? I don't know, right? We live in a period of time where we are more connected than we have ever been. We're not just transporting things on shipping vessels anymore. We're flying, we're driving, we're sailing. Influenza doesn't just travel through human vectors. If you have a type A strain of influenza, like this was during the epidemic, a type A strain transmits between humans and birds, sometimes swine. So you're not even worrying about, it traveling to humans and mutating. It can travel to birds and mutate. Birds can fly fucking everywhere. Birds can fly across continents, across bodies of water, right? I'm rambling. Sorry.
No, I'm just terrified and silent.
So here's what should really convince you, though, right?
If we needed it.
In 1957, there was an H2N2 influenza pandemic called the Asian flu, resulting in 1 to 2 million deaths globally, and nearly 70,000 of those occurred in the US. In 1968, there was a H3N2 influenza pandemic called the Hong Kong flu, where 1 million people died worldwide. 2009, the H1N1 flu. This is really distantly related to the 1918 strain, actually. This is called swine flu, right? We all remember that in 2009.
Mm-hmm. Hell yeah. I remember one of my friends coughing up blood in the middle of class.
Yeah, it was a really nasty one.
She was a doozy.
It caused 300,000 deaths worldwide, which is less, right? But within the first year, it infected 10 to 20% of the world's population.
God.
That's fast. That is very fast, right? And this is not too far from our reality, people. People have forgotten what could happen if there's another pandemic. And I don't really know if there's anything else I could really do to articulate what could happen if there is, right? 1918 happened because people underestimated it, because every sign that there's something off or every opportunity to fix it, oh, it's just a seasonal cold, oh, I've had that before, oh, it's never been a big deal before. Mother Nature is just one fucking roulette game, ladies and gents. All it took was a few mutations before this strain of H1N1 became known as the mother of all pandemics. And now every time I hear people say, oh, I've gotten the flu before, it's not that bad, throwing aside they're probably confusing influenza with the stomach flu, or I haven't gotten the flu shot so far and I've been fine, right? I think that comes from we haven't seen how bad it could get.
Or my personal favorite, which is I don't get the flu shot anymore. It makes me sick.
Which is, we don't have time.
I think at the end of the day too, it's like our science. Obviously, we've come a long way. We understand mutations in genes much better than we did in 1918. Right? We have medical research that's absolutely incredible, and I'm constantly amazed every day about the new medical research that we put out. It's phenomenal. Scientists are doing incredible things with the technology we have, but that only works if we're all taking the fucking vaccines and getting flu shots, kids. Because other than that, and it's even if you're like, oh, I don't want to, it makes me sick or whatever, think about the people that you're affecting through that.
Yeah. You're condemning people to possible death, but definite illness.
Right.
And the aside I want to say is, like, it's very normal for you to feel kind of ill after the flu shot. Personally, I get kind of nasally. Brooke doesn't experience anything. Fuck that bitch. But I mean, like, it's
better than everybody.
It's a normal response. Any vaccine you get, they put things in it that'll essentially trigger an immune response, so your body can go to the place of injection, see that there are benign virus particles that they've inactivated, so it's not going to infect you. It's physically impossible for the flu vaccine to infect you with flu, but you will feel mildly sick as your body tries to fight it, and then it imprints the identity of the influenza strain, and then you develop your immunity, right? Normal thing, but very fitting, and I wanted to wrap up with this podcast with why this keeps me up at night, with a quote from somebody else. Tom Frieden, the head of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, was asked when he was stepping down from his position what keeps him up at night. And he said, the biggest concern is always for an influenza pandemic. It really is the worst case scenario. And, you know, if the head of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, who's seen every outbreak, who's seen Ebola, HIV, TB, HPV, everything under the sun, if the one thing that he is afraid of is an influenza pandemic, I really hope this podcast explains why. You know, there was a lot that we could do to contain it in 1918, but just consider how mobile everyone is nowadays, how much interaction you have from day to day, how much travel occurs. Think of just flying in the air, airfare. It is the worst case scenario.
Fucking money, just like exchange of hands. Like you're in contact with human beings at all points of the day, regardless of whether or not you know it.
Yeah. Yep.
And there was a video I saw where they were talking, they said a lot of people consider like the illness, but the economic impact of something like that happening would fucking decimate us, right? Like, when we had SARS, like the SARS outbreak, I believe, in the Philippines, like the Pacific Island area, I think it cost the Philippines $50 billion in a single year. If you consider the people that aren't showing up to work, that aren't purchasing things, that aren't going out and spending money, the money that they had to spend on healthcare, and that's one little ass island, my friends. Like, a global pandemic, I don't even have the time to get in what would be impacted if there was one. But it would be very bad, and all you have to fucking do is once a year get a fucking flu shot
for free. There are places that offer it for free.
It's free, guys, please. Also, we didn't go into it at all, and like, I'm kind of glad because we do not have the time. But if you're an anti-vaxxer, you can do everybody a favor and jump off a bridge.
Oh my God, Brooke.
Jesus Christ. We'll have another episode on the vaccine things. We don't have the time today. But if you want to do me a favor, just look up, like, usually what I'll do is I'll do like flu shot myths debunked, and there are absolutely a plethora of scientific articles out there that explain and debunks every aspect of the flu shots, why you can't get the flu from the flu shot, why it needs to work. And it's really, truly, it doesn't work unless we're all on the same boat, unless we're all doing this together, gang, right? Like,
we're
the
all
more
in
hosts...
this together.
Yes! It's like we've learned nothing from High School Musical, friends.
Troy Bolton is
time
going to be
gone?
extremely disappointed if you don't get your flu shot this season.
And we all fucking know how important he is to us.
Oh my god, can we talk about Zac Efron for a second?
No, we're not. So just to wrap
Get your flu
up,
shot.
like,
Google is free. You can
Google
look up
is
everything
free.
you want to know.
Also,
just to wrap up and do a highlight reel, what was everybody's most shocking part of this podcast?
the fucking Pennsylvania not having enough trees to make the coffins was pretty fucking staggering to me.
Have you
That's
seen
what did it for you?
Pennsylvania?
Yeah.
Have you seen Pennsylvania? It's all trees. Pennsylvania is all trees.
Shout out to
It's
Pennsylvania.
just trees.
Yeah. Also, we have like 6 listeners in Pennsylvania, so shout out to
Yo! Hi.
What up?
And I think, one thing that you can do is obviously get your flu shot. The other thing that you can do is go on iTunes and
if you could give us a review, that would be greatly appreciated. iTunes has a funky algorithm. They only promote us as much as we get reviewed. The more reviews we have, the more promotion we get on iTunes. We appreciate all of the reviews that we get on iTunes, and really it does mean a great deal. Burp.
I thought you were getting
the
emotional. I was like, oh, Olivia.
No, I burped.
Okay.
You can follow the podcast on TTK Me Up on both Twitter and Instagram. We are working on getting a website, ladies and gents.
Yes,
it's going
we
to
are.
be incredible. But yeah, thank you for listening in. Share us with your friends. If this podcast freaked you the fuck out, you know what you should do? You should sit someone down and force them to listen to this to completion so that they get their flu shot. But also, tell them to leave an iTunes review. We would really,
Yeah, tell your friends.
we
Yeah,
would
honestly,
greatly
the best
appreciate it.
advertising for us if you want us to keep making these episodes is just telling your friends. Word of mouth is so important for us.
Yeah.
If you like us, let us know.
Also, we're going to be doing really exciting things in the future, exciting topics that you guys have suggested to us. So we're taking your considerations into mind. And just like the flu, you can only spread it
Human to
Word
human
of
contact.
mouth. Oh man.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to hear the other epidemics because I have some theories on what y'all will be doing, but I'm a girl for virology, so very excited. It's gonna bum you out. Honestly, I think the biggest part that bummed me out about this is just like, this is one of the most horrific things I've ever read about, and nobody fucking knows about it.
Yeah.
Nobody knows how bad it is.
Yeah,
you know?
that was staggering that, like, it's the Spanish influenza, and it had nothing really to do with Spain at all.
That's what got Brooke.
I am just...
Actually, there's a
aghast.
couple of other theories too. One of the theories is there was an upper respiratory disease that was in China in 1917, and essentially we had made a deal with China that they would be our allies on the terms that they send us. I'm not gonna say slaves.
But it was slaves, right?
But slaves. And so they shipped a lot of Chinese over, and we, of course, cramped them onto trains, which turned into plague trains, and they all got very sick with upper respiratory infections, and they were being shipped across the US and Canada to help, like, build things and remove landmines, good ways to treat human beings.
Definitely.
That's just one theory. I don't want to say that's the correct one. There's so many. You could look into this. This is just a fucking adventure.
Yeah.
It's just wild, dude. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate it. It's been real, guys.
Love you. Call your friends.
Deuces.
Bye.
See ya.